Thanks everyone for being here today. And for those of you who were part of our meeting yesterday, you will have seen most of the content in this presentation. As Elizabeth mentioned, this is a follow-up to last year's presentation by Leah Cook, then of the Maine Department of Agriculture, and it was a really exciting presentation, so I have big shoes to fill this year. But basically, we're looking at a qualitative analysis of information provided by inspectors across the region of the most common misunderstandings, non-compliance issues, and technical assistance needs that they've identified over the past year of inspections. So looking at the regional context here, inspectors conducted a mix of initial and routine PSR inspections this past year. And what we'll see today is that there are some persistent misunderstandings and non-compliance issues across the region. And also that folks are looking ahead to revised agricultural water requirements, as well as the proposed rule on traceability. So I also want to thank Elizabeth for collecting data from all of our Northeast states this year, and also thank you again to everyone for participating today, for your commitment to both public health and making sure growers really have the resources they need to successfully implement the produce safety rule. That's really what this presentation is all about. So Elizabeth asked the same 3 questions of inspectors last year that Leah and Elizabeth asked inspectors the previous year, or this year as last year. What common misunderstandings did farms have about food safety or PSR regulatory requirements during inspections in 2021? What were the most common non-compliance observations or issues observed? And what types of technical assistance do you need in your state? And as a follow-up, are there specific knowledge areas or delivery formats that you've identified a need for? We had participation from all of the states in our region. So again, I want to thank all of the inspectors who've been conducting inspections on farms during a global pandemic for 2 seasons now, and who generously took the time to provide data on common misunderstandings, non-compliance issues, and technical assistance needs. This is a quick summary of our topics for 2021. We saw some persistent misunderstandings in areas like PSR coverage and the qualified exemption, audits and inspections, cleaning and sanitizing. And in addition to some of these conceptual misunderstandings, inspectors noted common compliance issues in the areas of cleaning and sanitizing, record keeping, equipment, tools, and buildings, worker training, and hand washing. They also identified technical assistance needs to address these compliance areas, as well as agricultural water. And they talked about a need for resources on traceability, as well as resources and translation services for additional languages. So these are the top 5 misunderstanding areas identified in 2021: cleaning and sanitizing, audits versus inspections, records, produce safety rule coverage and the qualified exemption, and agricultural water requirements. So we'll dive right in and look at these in a little bit more depth. Inspectors continued to see confusion about the difference between cleaning and sanitizing this year, including misunderstandings about how to effectively clean and sanitize in that order, and differentiating between detergents and sanitizers. One inspector shared that a lack of the suggested cleaning and sanitizing frequency can cause confusion for growers, and this is a topic that comes up in the technical assistance area, as some growers might benefit from help in developing cleaning and sanitizing SOPs. Another area of concern is the difference between hand washing and hand sanitizing, and an inspector noted that the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have encouraged wider use of hand sanitizer, but actually shifted the focus away from hand washing in some cases. So what we're really seeing here are still some major misunderstandings between cleaning versus sanitizing and hand washing versus hand sanitizing. Inspectors also face continued confusion about audits versus inspections this year. Some growers do not understand why they need both a USDA GAP and a produce safety rule inspection. Others growers think that if they are GAP certified, they don't need a PSR inspection. And finally, some think that the GAP audit is the PSR inspection. On the other hand, one inspector noted that farms without audit experience may be intimidated by the PSR inspection process, and another noted that some farms that have completed audits for many years were actually pretty well prepared for inspection. Record keeping continues to be an area where there is a general misunderstanding about a general lack of record keeping, which records need to be kept, the actual record requirements outlined in Subpart O, such as dates, initials, or signatures. And one inspector also noted confusion about identifying the right equipment for documenting cleaning and sanitizing. Inspectors also noted grower confusion around PSR coverage and how to determine whether a farm is eligible for a qualified exemption using that difference between food sales and produce sales. At the same time, others did not realize that the qualified exempt farms do have to meet certain documentation requirements under the rule. And inspectors also saw misunderstandings around identifying covered and non-covered or rarely consumed raw produce, which again differs from that selected commodities concept that many growers are already accustomed to from GAP audits. Some of the misunderstandings that inspectors noted related to agricultural water included the idea that Subpart E is under review, so paying attention to it is not important, the number of water tests that will be required and water rule compliance, how to monitor and maintain post-harvest water treatment systems, such as UV treatment, and how to accurately monitor sanitizers and turbidity in recirculated post-harvest water. Some of the additional areas of misunderstanding that arose included the adequacy of cleaning tools and equipment, risks related to stored tools, equipment, and produce, difference between washing, buffing, or wiping, and rinsing the produce itself, understanding that GAP or other food safety training is not a substitute for the Produce Safety Alliance grower training, and also the need to retrain farm employees each year in food safety, even if they worked on the farm for many years. We also saw some confusion around food handling and produce safety training versus general job training or pesticide training, other types of training that workers might be involved in, and handling covered and rarely consumed raw produce during harvest, in terms of shared equipment, and also storage. So we're going to move into our common non-compliance issues, and we'll see a lot of similarities here. The top 5 non-compliance issues were records, cleaning and sanitizing again, equipment, tools, and buildings. And there were really 2 areas of non-compliance here. One was equipment or tools that cannot be cleaned because of the way they were designed, constructed, or because of damage. And secondly, contaminations from building and storage itself, because the wash pack area might need to be renovated, or there's possible contamination from floors, walls, pipes, and drip or condensate. In addition, worker training and hand washing were common non-compliance issues. Some of the non-compliance issues we see around records, again, are just around the general record components, which records to establish and keep. And in particular, there was a lack of records around cleaning and sanitizing, worker training, treatment of biological soil amendments of animal origin, and records related to water. In the areas of cleaning and sanitizing, inspectors noted a lack of cleaning and sanitizing in some cases, confusion about understanding the difference between cleaning and sanitizing, how to clean and sanitize food contact surfaces, how to keep harvest containers clean, and how to manage non-food contact surfaces as well. In the area of equipment, tools, and buildings, again, there are kind of 2 sub-areas here where folks saw some non-compliance issues. Equipment or tools that can't be cleaned because of the way they were designed or constructed, or damage or inadequate maintenance. Contaminations from buildings and storage ranged from preventing produce contamination through floors, walls, and ceiling, condensate drip onto produce or in a product flow zone, storage of produce and walk-in refrigeration units, pest control and bird exclusion in buildings, and the location of packing material and harvest bin storage. The area of worker training, while some farms had a total lack of worker training, other farms just didn't have the documentation or the record keeping related to their worker training. Some areas where this might be an indication that worker training wasn't effective is hand jewelry that can't be adequately cleaned, worn when workers hand cover produce, or eating, chewing gum, or using tobacco in areas used for covered activities. And one inspector shared this idea that I thought was really powerful, that getting growers to implement daily procedures and then training staff to follow those procedures has actually proven challenging for many growers. So they've expressed frustration with staff not following procedures, even if repeated corrections have been made on the spot. So I think the decision to focus on worker training over the course of our meeting today and tomorrow is going to be really important, because we're seeing that even growers who are conducting the required worker training might need some additional technical assistance to really make that training stick. Hand washing noncompliances were found in two major areas. The first was that hand washing facilities might lack soap, running water, and or a drying device, and the case that employees might not be washing their hands before starting work or before putting on gloves. So again, this is a worker training issue in many cases. There were 5 to 6 major technical assistance needs that inspectors noted. Here I actually broke out water into 2 areas. So again, cleaning and sanitizing, revised agricultural water requirements, post-harvest water maintenance and treatment, equipment, tools, and buildings, once again, worker training materials and translation, and lastly, traceability plans and recall procedures, again, looking ahead to that traceability rule. The inspectors noted that growers need some technical assistance around understanding cleaning versus sanitizing, how to clean and sanitize, including information about the zones concept, how to develop effective cleaning routines and SOPs, where to source appropriate cleaning and sanitation supplies, and also examples of efficient apple bin cleaning procedures for large orchards would be helpful. In the area of water, inspectors really feel that growers are going to need quite a bit of technical assistance on the revised agricultural water requirements, including information and training, information particularly on that water quality risk assessment and testing, guidance on adjacent land use, agricultural water sanitation and treatment, including monitoring and maintenance of post-harvest water treatment systems like UV, and in-field services to help growers understand how the water requirements apply to their operations in particular. The areas of equipment, tools, and buildings, when it comes to this area, growers will benefit from technical assistance from retrofitting old wash pack areas, maintaining cooler condenser units, especially older units, pest management and packing and storage areas, including bird exclusion, as well as information about proper storage. In the areas of training, inspectors would like to see technical assistance for growers just in general food safety planning, creating logs and records. In particular, one grower mentioned on-farm food safety videos and an on-farm pathogen fact sheet would be helpful. And again, training tools for supervisors and farm owners to actually train their field crews. Translation assistance also came up this year, and inspectors would like to see materials and training resources in additional languages. Traditional and simplified Chinese and Korean were mentioned specifically, and potentially a list of trainers or PSA trained individuals who can provide translation services in the field when necessary. Finally, the area of traceability and recall came up, and looking forward to the traceability rule, people would like to see resources for developing traceability plans and recall procedures in preparation for the new rule. So here I've included the table that Leah constructed for her analysis last year. And what we're seeing are a lot of the same misunderstandings, compliance issues, and technical assistance needs. The red coding here were the most common issues that came up last year. And what we're seeing are, there's still some general misunderstandings around audits versus FSMA, PSR coverage, cleaning and sanitizing, hand washing noncompliance issues. And one thing that didn't come up quite as much this year was dropped covered produce, but there were still quite a few misunderstandings about covered produce and differentiating between covered produce and rarely consumed raw produce. So I have color-coded this in a slightly similar way for our summary table once again. These areas where we're seeing both misunderstandings and compliance issues as well as TA needs are Cleaning and sanitizing, that's the big one. Records, equipment, tools, and buildings, worker training. So it's exciting. We'll get to talk about that today. But I also want to point out that I think even though they aren't really coming up as misunderstandings or compliance issues yet, traceability and translation is going to continue to be important in the future. So when we look at this together, I want to note that this isn't a comprehensive study of every noncompliance issue or every observation noted on a farm in our region, but these are the most common misunderstandings and noncompliance issues as identified by the inspectors who are out there on the ground. And growers would benefit from technical assistance in several areas. Now, when I look at this list after I made it, I said, wow, cleaning and sanitizing, record keeping, equipment, tools and buildings, worker training, water, traceability. That's pretty much the entire rule plus traceability. But I don't think that's indicative of us not making progress, but rather the fact that these are still really early days. A lot of farms are undergoing their initial inspections, maybe their first routine inspection, and maybe their third inspection at most. So we are really set up well to continue to provide the technical assistance and education resources that we have been providing, but also to develop new areas of focus and make sure that we can continue to serve growers and meet our public health obligations in the future. So I've got some of my contact information up here. You can learn more about Vermont at agriculture.vermont.gov/produce program, and we're always happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. I really appreciate this thorough overview. We do have a couple of questions. One, and I don't have the answer to this, and I know you don't either, Christina, but I think we could crowdsource it very quickly. The one question is there an overall data on how many farms this assessment data is based on? I'm assuming it's a lot because it includes 12 states. So yes, it is 12 states, all the states in the Northeast region. I did not ask the states to tell me how many inspections they conducted in the last year, and that could be a question we add in the future to inform this information a bit more. But in order to help, I know all of you are out there on this call. If you want to, from the individual states, just type in how many inspections were conducted in your state, that we could kind of pull that together pretty quickly. Unless, Christina, you have anything to add to it.
No, I think that there's a big range from our states. And so that's what I actually think is interesting about some of these responses is that, you know, we had, I think, one state where there may have been as few as 8 inspections all the way through. I'm assuming that the most inspections likely took place in New York, or maybe New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I'm not sure. But we have quite a lot of similarities despite the differing number of inspections taking place across the region in each state. Another question we're seeing here is, did questions about disinfectants come up with some of the COVID guidelines? Yeah, that wasn't identified as a common misunderstanding. So those questions may have come up in different states. And I think that's interesting when, you know, I think back almost 2 years ago, thinking like, wow, we just got to the point of where we're like teaching people the difference between cleaning and sanitizing. And now we've got to teach cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfection. And I just don't think we're quite there yet. And that it isn't a specific requirement of the rule either. But great question.
Yeah, and Liz from New Jersey just added that they did 227 inspections in New Jersey. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Christina. I really appreciate you presenting on this. And if there are more questions, please put them into the chat. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Laura and Shauna to do the next part of their presentations. Laura Pineda Bermudez and Shauna Henley have both been taking on some worker training resource development initiatives over the last year. And so I'd like to turn to them to introduce those projects.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Pineda Bermudez, and I'm an extension aide for the National Good Agricultural Practices Program at Cornell University. Today, I will be talking a little bit about the development of a worker training resource toolkit. So after the educator work group meetings as part of the past couple of NECAFS annual meetings, the need for diverse worker training resources came up as an identified need in our region by both growers and educators. Reports from the local food safety collaborative listening sessions from our region and the rest of the country also indicate that growers are requesting these types of tools. In the listening sessions, growers specifically cited lack of training resources as a barrier to improving food safety practices on their farm. So producers request these resources that are tailored to their operations and that could be easily used to train their workers. Interestingly enough, though, this type of resource that they were describing actually does exist, and growers are unaware or unable to access these resources. So the problem here is that there's many materials available, but there's the question of whether or not these resources are good or not. Growers are unsure of how or where to find these resources, and growers are unsure on how to best use these resources available to train employees to reduce their risk. In thinking about how best to address these problems, we had these main goals driving our decisions: to identify worker training materials that were in existence as of fall of 2020, to evaluate the quality of the existing materials, and to understand the gaps in the resources available for worker training. Therefore, we set out to develop a worker training toolkit, so a packet of diverse training materials for growers to use to train their workers on food safety topics. The approach to create this toolkit started off by identifying the resources available to train workers. I looked through the NECAFS clearinghouse first, and then moved on to other sources such as state and extension sites, followed up by a quick Google search to see if anything fell through the cracks. Now, this happened in the fall of 2020, so I'm sure that there have been more resources developed since this initial survey, but 92 resources came up from that search. Each resource was tagged with codes from a code book that I created, and these codes were short strings of letters to describe characteristics that each resource had. So each column had different options, unique options, code options in each column. And examples of columns include type of resource. So what format is it in? Is it a video? Is it a fact sheet? Is it a game that you can play? What language was this resource available in? Is it English? Is it Spanish? Is it offered in both languages? Maybe Hmong? Who is this intended audience? Was this for growers or for workers or for educators? What subjects were covered in this resource? Who created this resource? Those were the types of questions or column titles. And this coding method was meant to further our understanding on what kinds of resources we truly had available and what characteristics they possessed. So by the end of this whole process, I had created a database of sorts that cataloged the available resources to train workers on food safety concepts. And these cataloged resources were then evaluated by a team of 4 extension educators in the Northeast using a rubric. This rubric was developed by Annie Fitzgerald, and it rated resources on whether the resource was clear and easy to view, whether the importance of food safety was explained, whether it was clearly summarized, whether it was effectively explained, whether the resource or the tool contained usable information. And all of these questions helped develop an overall score. And this overall score was used in conjunction with the reviewer comments, and the reviewers were then asked to decide whether they would recommend this resource or not. And out of the 92 identified resources, 51 were recommended by the majority of the reviewers, so 3 or 4 of the reviewers. And of those 51, 26 resources were recommended by all of the reviewers. There's a couple main takeaways from this whole cataloging and rating process in discovering or unearthing the resources. There's lots of training resources available. We already knew that. But now we know that the quality and the content accuracy does vary. And I want to remind you all that out of the 92 resources that were identified, only 26 could be recommended by all of the reviewers. And this process showed that there should be an external review process that takes into consideration some of this quality and accuracy of the resource. Some of the more nitty-gritty aspects like the consistency in the language, the tone, the attitude towards food safety, the clarity of the information presented, the grammar or the spelling, all of these things really do make a difference in the quality. And this all combined with the accuracy truly does determine or could determine whether a grower should or should not be using something to train their workers. Secondly, the large number, the types of resources, and the range and the quality of the resources make it difficult and a time-intensive process for growers to sort through these materials on their own. The different locations of the resources also add to the difficulty of locating the right one for their operation and for their workers. So having a specific portal that houses these vetted materials can enhance the distribution and use of the best resources out there for growers to use while training their workers. And lastly, some trends in these existing resources that I would like to point out are the good and the gaps. So the good, some of the resources that were most highly rated and recommended were concise, they had clear summaries, and whenever possible, had step-by-step descriptions. On the other hand, reviewers pointed out that they would want to see more resources in languages besides English and Spanish, but that also comes along with the need for reviewers that are able to assess the quality of those materials as well. Reviewers also pointed out that they would like to see more resources that can help with establishing a food safety culture and resources with more on-farm photos instead of diagrams or cartoons. So now that these resources have been vetted by extension educators, the trends and the patterns, the good things have been identified, and the recommendations on access or distribution have been mentioned. What's next? So we have to make sure that these resources also have the characteristics that fit or meet the needs of the workers and the growers by asking them directly to review these materials. Are these resources usable for you, for your operation, and for your workers? And once we know a little bit more about whether these resources would actually be used by folks on the ground, training workers, and whether they're good for what they need them to be, only then could we really start to build and recommend a worker training toolkit for growers. So only then could we start developing this packet of worker training materials to provide to growers to train their workers. And this is exactly where I hand off the reins to Angela and Shauna for their presentation on their FSAP. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great rest of the meeting. If anyone has any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. And if not, Shauna's video can go ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I'm Shauna Henley with the University of Maryland Extension, and I'm just going to outline our recent awarded FSAP grant. And so our team and I, the title is TRAIN. It stands for Targeted Resources Addressing Identified Needs in Maryland's Worker Food Safety Training via On-Farm Piloting of a Mixed Media Toolkit. And our research team's composed of myself, Dr. Angela Ferrelli-Gruber. We also have the University of Maryland's Eastern Shore, Nicole Cook, JD, Mr. Baron Rogers, and Dr. Melinda Schwartz from the University of New Mexico State University, rather. We have Doctors Pamela Martinez and Barbara Chamberlain. So for our project, we realized through some of the surveys that our team implemented over the years was that we were seeing that the farmers were saying that they were going to be able to implement worker food safety training around health and hygiene. And by the time we came to on-farm readiness reviews, we saw that some of the hygiene pieces, as well as some other key food safety duties that would also fall under the worker training piece, weren't meeting the needs as it relates to PSR. So our team developed a project that is hoping to address worker training as well as improve food safety culture on farm operations for small and mid-sized specialty crop farms in Maryland. And we feel that the resources that we develop are going to be able to help other similar sized farms in the Mid-Atlantic and hopefully nationally. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is that we would really like to strengthen food safety culture. We also want to implement practices or just highlight different techniques for training workers to be more efficient in food safety. So beyond the health and hygiene, but things like monitoring sanitizer solutions, for example, better PPE practices around farms that have animals as well as crops. And so ultimately what we're looking to do is to have resources for worker training, and we also want to provide a train the trainer for farm managers, owners, supervisors that are training these workers. And some of the things that we'll talk about is our objectives. So for our first objective, we're working on developing a food safety network in Maryland. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is strengthen our collaboration on a statewide scale that includes academia, industry, so that representing our farmers, as well as nonprofits that focus on farm workers, and maybe not necessarily the food safety piece. Our second piece is we want to implement a food safety needs assessment survey to small and medium-sized farm workers, as well as the owners and managers. And we just want to see what's going on with training. How has COVID possibly shifted training? What things will stick? What things they're moving away from since the pandemic started? Another thing that the survey will help us with is start to create our toolkit for worker training, as well as the train the trainer for farm owners and supervisors that are training workers in food safety. So for that piece, we're going to work with New Mexico State University, and we're hoping that the survey is going to dictate the type of materials we make. So whether it's print, digital, both, we're keeping an open mind at that point. And for the survey, as well as the materials that we do create, we hired a student to provide a lit review, and then we've also are working now to implement the survey pending IRB approval. So once we develop our toolkit, as well as the train the trainer model, we're going to implement it. So the idea here, and you can see in a little bit more detail, is that we're going to have something called our Flagship Farms, where we're going to provide them both the train the trainer, as well as the toolkit and technical assistance from our research team. So any sort of late night, weekend kind of phone calls, we're there to answer. And we're going to implement this throughout a growing season. We're also going to recruit additional farms that are going to act more as our control. So they'll receive the toolkit as well as the train the trainer piece, but they won't receive any technical assistance from the research team until after the growing season. And this will help us compare and contrast what method was more successful. In terms of evaluating the toolkit and the train the trainer, we're going to use case studies. We'll also do some snowball survey sampling, some semi-structured interviews between farm workers as well as their supervisors. And then we'll also use an on-farm readiness review to help evaluate how successful these farms were after receiving our materials that we were able to develop through the grant. In terms of dissemination, we're really hoping to disseminate additional toolkits and resources to local farms in Maryland. And if we still have extra the goal would be to reach out to other farms in our region with what we have developed, whether it's a physical product or just the education and the tools electronically. And again, we're hoping that our toolkit as well as our train the trainer are going to be pieces that are applicable for Maryland, the Mid-Atlantic region, and hopefully nationally as well. So right now, as you can see with our results, we've completed the lit review. We're still waiting for IRB approval for our needs assessment survey. And then we're still looking at best practices in terms of a model network to build our Maryland's food safety network off of. We're also trying to increase study awareness for survey participation recruitment. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shauna and Laura. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Shauna, there was a question about sharing your flow chart. I know on the slide it was a little tight to read it all, so maybe we could share that.
I'll make sure there's a better image and send it out.
Wonderful. So if there are additional questions, please put them in the chat. But in the sort of keeping on with the agenda, given the time, I will move us into the next session.